So, hi everyone. Most of you will have been here for the judging class that Noah has already used. So, I'm going to try not to be too repetitive, but if I am being repetitive, then please just let me know and I'm going to move on. Also, this presentation itself will definitely not take the full 2 hours. So, I think at the end of this, a good exercise might be to take some time to continue watching the rest of that debate and focus on how you would give constructive criticisms to the teams and feedback that they might go looking forward. I think this is probably going to be a more constructive use of your time than me trying to make up, an extra the 30 to 40 minutes of material just for the sake of it. And obviously the goal here is to make sure that everyone learns. So this class is going to focus primarily on feedback, oral adjudications, and providing constructive criticisms for teams. So the first question that I think people need to ask themselves is, what is your objective as an adjudicator? And if you have that in mind, then I think it becomes much clearer how you ought to be structuring your feedback, but also how you should be taking notes while you're judging. So after we have a little bit of a discussion of what you're trying to achieve, we can then look at how you achieve that. And the first stage is making sure that you're taking notes during the debate in a way that becomes useful to you when you have to give that decision. Then in how you should structure your feedback and that decision to make your results as clear as possible. And finally, the things that you ought to be emphasizing for teams so that your decision doesn't just explain the result, but also provide them guidance on how they can do better in the future. Because I think that's the sort of adjudication that teams and debaters really value the most. Okay, so what are my objectives as an adjudicator? I personally am of the philosophy that judging is equally valuable and competitive as speaking, and that's something that I think should also translate to how seriously you take your position as an adjudicator and you try to achieve the best result you can in every stage of the tournament. But ultimately, you can think of what the adjudicator exists to do as having kind of 3 separate responsibilities. So that first responsibility is the competitive responsibility that I mentioned like a few seconds ago, where you have a responsibility towards yourself, but you also have a responsibility towards the competition to make sure that the right teams get the right results, and the responsibility towards the individuals in those teams to help them understand why they're getting the results that they're getting. So these 3 responsibilities, towards the competition, towards teams, and towards yourself, are the kind of basis, I think, for what you ought to be trying to achieve during your adjudications. And this is going to focus primarily on these last 2, so providing useful oral adjudications that mean that you are valued as a judge, but also helping teams get useful feedback. I think that those 2 things naturally end up resulting in the best performing debaters in your round achieving the best results. Because if you're trying to get a good oral adjudication and you're trying to make it so that you can explain your results as clearly as possible during the process of the debate while you're taking your notes and so on, by definition, you end up adjudicating the debate better. Because you're focusing on what things really make sense and how to compare them and make it clear that that comparison is a justified one instead of one that relies upon your intuitions. So even though what you're trying to do is just collect useful feedback for teams, provide useful oral adjudications, and make it as clear as possible to help them understand the result, you naturally end up creating better results and better adjudications as a consequence of that. Okay, so that means that as an adjudicator, you have to make sure that you're evaluating the debate correctly, clearly, fairly, explain that reasoning thoroughly, and make it as easy as possible for the teams to understand how their arguments were credited, what was valuable, what was not valuable, and also identify the sorts of errors that those teams are making. So one mistake that I see judges fall into a lot when teams ask them for feedback, or after the debate is done and the official oral adjudication is done when people go in to request individual feedback, is judges end up giving them feedback on the debate that just happened and the kind of context of that specific motion, which is great, but they're never going to do that motion again in this competition. So knowing that I did really badly in a debate about the Eurozone is not actually useful information for me for the next 4 rounds of the debate tournament. And so instead, as a judge, you should also be trying to pick out strategic errors they're making or errors in technique that you can identify and perhaps, so if you've seen a team once, you maybe don't know whether that's a mistake they're making consistently, but if you can at least identify that they did make that mistake in this one round, that then provides the impetus for that team to maybe try and focus on that going into a future round. And hopefully that leads to them performing better as well, or feeling like they really learned something. So your identification is going to be most useful when it's applicable to all debates or applicable to lots of future debates, not just the specific one that you've seen the teams in. Okay, so we're trying to achieve this. How can I make it as easy as possible as a judge to be able to achieve that? So the first thing is, like I said before, giving good feedback is the same as good judging, and the two go hand in hand. So actually this question is, how can I make sure that my evaluation as an adjudicator is as fair as possible, as clear as possible, so that I can give that as feedback to the teams? And this is what my judging notes look like. This is an entire debate. I'm one of those people that really needs to see all the information laid out in front of me, and you can see that I write in tiny, tiny writing. And if I can't fit an entire debate onto an A4 sheet of paper, I get really stressed out. And everybody has their own style, right? Like the reason I put this up here is because my way of writing notes and structuring my debates is actually quite different to a lot of other note takers. Like most judges won't take all of their notes on a single A4 piece of paper like this. But the point is that it doesn't matter how you take your notes. You just have to pick the style that works for you and works for what you need. But there are a few things that,
Is it just an A4?
Yeah. Yeah, so this is, I actually have a notebook, so this is one A5 side, this is another A5 side. I really like keeping a notebook as both a speaker and an adjudicator because it means that you don't lose your notes, you always have them with you. As an adjudicator, it's actually particularly useful because you can then refer back easily to debates that may have taken place on a previous day or in a previous tournament. If a team comes up to you for feedback and they can say, actually, you've seen this debate a couple of times now, what do you think? Most of the time, debaters will have slowly started to forget past debates, and so I think that it's good to have these notes to hand and keep them with you. But that's just a personal preference. I like having the book with me. I'm really sentimental. I write my feelings in there. Anyway, the point is, so everyone has their own way of taking notes. But there are some things from here that I want to draw your attention to specifically. So the first thing is here in red, right? So I've written the word imp, and I put it in brackets. The way you do this doesn't make sense as long as you know what your system is. Some people use different colored pens, some people will highlight. I like to write as much as possible, so I don't like changing pens around, and so I basically use symbols. I use symbols, and brackets always means a thought that I'm having about the debate. So imp here is short for importance, right? So that means that in this debate, I'm questioning what the importance of that argument is. And it might be that the speaker is just about to explain what the importance of this argument is, in which case I can give it a little tick like, yep, they've cleared that off or whatever. But the point is, there is a question in my mind about this argument, and I note down that I have this question. And other ones that I write down are often like rel, which is relevant, or cons, which is like, so what was the consequence? Why, this is a big one. My notes are covered with me just writing the word why over and over again. But the point is, if at any point you have a question about the thing that the person has said, you're just like, oh, I wonder what this means. That is adjudication in action. That is a flaw that you have identified or an inadequacy that you have identified in the argumentation as it's being provided, and you need to note it down. And the reason you need to note it down is because this is the only way you can give people specific feedback. You can say, well, you said this thing, and then there was this thing missing that I was wondering about, and then you moved on to your next sentence or whatever. This way, the teams, when they receive their adjudication, know exactly which step of the chain they have the missing link in, rather than getting an adjudication in which someone says something quite vague to them like, I felt like you didn't analyze things deeply enough, or you weren't comparative enough. Well, actually, if you could say, at this point, I identified this and so on and so forth, they can hone in on what they had missed out, and I think it's easier for them to understand. So that's what the red one is, just me talking about importance. In green, you can see that I've got a little tick. So that little tick just means that back and forth issue that was being discussed throughout the debate eventually comes to like a conclusion over there, and that's it, like the question gets settled, you know? So in this debate, it was about, what was this debate about? It was something about post-Soviet states using their national narrative, like of throwing off oppression against Russia, I think. I promise I didn't pick it specifically for the Kazakhstan meetup, but anyway, the point is, so there's a back and forth about like what this is going to do to Russian-speaking populations in Baltic states and so on, and then eventually, all the teams disagree and prop it up. This is the person who gives me like a conclusive answer that I think is well justified, so I give it a tick. 2 ticks if something is like very, very sensible, makes a lot of sense. If I think something doesn't work, put a little cross by it. If I'm unsure about something, give it a squiggle, like whatever works for you. But as well as the questions that you're left asking, for each argument, give it a kind of score, right? Like I know judges that at the end of each argument will literally give it a score, A+ to F. And then they'll be able to, and they'll literally be like, okay, so this argument overall was good, or this argument overall was bad. This is great because then when it comes to giving teams feedback, you can say, these parts of your speech were good, these parts of your speech were bad, and you can provide them more nuanced and granular information about the speech that they just provided for you. And this, combined with this information, which is kind of more qualitative about what was missing, then combines in total to give them useful feedback on what errors they're currently providing. And obviously the job of constructive criticism is to identify those flaws, but to always identify those flaws in a way that provides the people you're giving that criticism to the space to improve upon them. And that only happens if you can identify what is missing, because then you can say, it would be better if you did this next time. The final thing that I want to draw your attention to is down here in purple, which is me asking like just a longer question. So these are basic things about analysis that every debate might have. Down here, I've just written, but why does this mean Russia cannot be appealed to? So sometimes there will be things that you will be left asking yourself that are more kind of complex than just what is the importance, what is the relevance, why does this happen, and so on. Take note of those questions too. So the reason that that is important is because those are questions that the debate is starting to hinge around, because they're being left as big kind of question marks about the arguments that are happening. That's important because it then helps you identify which bits of other teams' cases end up beating or losing to this team's case. Because these are the big questions that they need to answer and that they need to prove to go further. And actually in this debate, the question of why does this mean Russia cannot be appealed to was then answered by the closing government team who spoke after this person. So it was good to know that this was the thing that I was left uncertain about from the OG team, because when CG provided it, that was the justification for why CG beats OG. And you can make comparative claims more easily when you're writing down information in this way. Okay, so I've been showing this up a lot in various classes that I've been running this week, and that's because this is literally like my Bible. This is the #1 thing that I do for all of my debating. All arguments broadly have the same underlying logic. So it's a policy, you have to prove that the policy is permissible, that we have an obligation or responsibility to achieve some outcome, that the action will be effective at achieving that outcome, that that outcome is a good one, and then finally that it's sufficiently desirable to outweigh alternatives. Belief motions like this house regrets, this house supports, this house believes that are actually simpler because it's constrained for you, like you're told what to believe or you're told how to judge whether or not it fits that criteria. But basically it's like, we believe this statement is true if these criteria are filled, this particular case fulfills the criteria, and then any evidence that the statement is false So what your opponents are saying is less strong than what we are saying. That's equivalent to this evaluation here. It's sufficiently desirable to outweigh alternatives. Understanding this is really, really key, I think, to judging well and to providing justifications that are fair and reasonable. Because these arguments relate to one another and are broadly hierarchical in nature. So what I mean by this is if an action is not legitimate, it does not matter whether it is effective or not, right? Because it's not legitimate, so you should not be permitted to do it. If an action is not effective, it doesn't matter whether the outcome you're trying to achieve is a good one or a bad one. Because if it's not effective, that outcome never exists. So in this way, policy motions have different types of claim that are connected to one another. And by and large, I honestly truly believe that about 99% of things that people say in an argument justifying a policy falls into one of these 5 categories. It is either a question about whether something is permissible, or it's a question about what we have specific responsibilities and obligations towards, or it's a claim about whether it's going to be effective in achieving outcomes, or it's a claim about what the outcomes are and whether the outcomes are good, or it's a comparison that says these outcomes are better than the alternatives we're sacrificing. Those are the only 5 things you can actually do in an argument. And all speeches are some combination of these 5 things, and then a little bit of like fairy dust to turn it into a speech instead of just a machine spitting out logic at you. As a judge, it's important to be able to identify this underlying structure from the speeches that you are assessing as well. And the reason for this is that when you're comparing how one team should beat another team, you can look at how they are interacting with different arguments. So for example, if one team spends a lot of their time focusing on why the outcomes are so important and that we should really care about them, and then another team doesn't engage with that. They don't rebut whether the outcomes are good or not, but they do a lot of work explaining that the outcomes won't take place because they're ineffective, and they say, and therefore the good outcome doesn't happen and this new bad outcome happens, that other team should win, even if they don't rebut directly with the good argument claims or like why this outcome is desirable claims from the first team. And even if that first team analyzes all of that stuff beautifully, it is still weaker than the second team because the logic of that comparison is one in which they win the higher level of the hierarchy. And so being able to identify what type of claim is being made by each team, you don't have to write it down, although if you find it useful, you can write it down and say, this is a claim about legitimacy, this is a claim about efficacy, this is a claim about comparison, like an evaluation between different sides, helps you to then start connecting the dots of your adjudication and deciding which team should beat which other team and why they should do it. It also makes it so crystal clear why teams have won or lost debates when you're providing them with feedback. And I have a reputation for relatively long oral justifications, partly because I'm really paranoid that everyone's going to hate me. So I really want to make sure everyone's on the same page. I promise I made this decision for good reasons. These are all of my reasons, and I explain them really clearly. But actually, if I get any credit as a judge, it's actually just because I do this, and I'm really trying to explain how each argument interacts with each other argument to make sure teams know that I'm not ignoring something that they said and that I am trying to consider everything. But that takes up tons of time, so the way that you save yourself that time is by doing it smart instead of doing it hard, and you just focus on what type of argument is happening, and then you make logical inferences using a framework like this one. Okay. So if some of those steps are missing, so for example, if a team does not provide you with, we have an obligation to do this, this action is going to achieve that outcome, and that outcome is a good one, then and it's better than the alternatives. If something is missing from that kind of chain, write it down. That is exactly what your job is, right? That is an analytical whole. That is a statement of kind of inadequacy or success comparing different teams is how many of these steps are they able to provide for you, right? Obviously, your time during a speech is very limited, and your ability to do all of those things might not be feasible. But the more that you are able to do, the better your speech is. And that's important to write down, not just because it allows you to make comparisons between different teams, provide them useful feedback, and so on and so forth, but also because if you are giving feedback to a team that won, and you have to tell them how they could do better, but they're already the best team in the room, the way that you do that is not by comparing them to other teams, but by comparing them to the best possible version of logic that they could have presented. And the best possible version of logic is the most complete version of logic, which is one that takes you from start to finish. The other important thing about this is that sometimes teams will leave things out, and every team will leave something out. So it's not obvious which team is doing a better job or a worse job. As an adjudicator, you should always make the smallest interference possible into the debate itself to complete arguments. Because if you don't do that, if you jump to conclusions for teams, you are debating against them rather than judging how they debated against each other. So sometimes it's necessary to make logical leaps in order to understand the intention or the value of an argument. You should make the smallest possible, the most obvious, the least controversial logical leaps you can in order to make them into a state where they can be compared against each other. So if you identify that steps are missing, take a note of it, write down what is missing, how that slots into the hierarchy of the argument, the tree of the argument, but also where you have to connect things that aren't connected step by the speaker, do so with the least amount of interference possible. You want to minimize the amount of input that you as a judge are putting into those arguments. Okay, this is a really important chart for what you should credit and how you should credit it. So on the y-axis here, at the bottom I've got assertion, and at the top I've got a proof. So a proof in this context is something which is uncontroversially true. It is always true. It must be true, based on the explanation that is being provided. An assertion, in this case, is something that is completely unjustified. It has no explanation explaining why it is true. It might be true, it might be a lie, but you have no certainty about whether it is true, right? And proof is about certainty. So like in mathematics, when we use the word proof, we use that to refer to something that we know must be true in these cases, or in all cases. And an assertion is the opposite of that. So the main focus of debate training and judge training tends to be on this axis, right? They're like, provide as much explanation as you can, and more explanation is actually the same as fewer assumptions, because an assertion is a lot of unsaid assumptions about what is true. If you just say Donald Trump is going to get elected again in 2020, that's an assertion, right? There's a bunch of assumptions that you must be making in order to make that assertion. But if you say Donald Trump is going to get elected again in 2020 because it's incredibly unlikely that any president that is incumbent will lose their seat, because there is a recency bias and people prefer something they know to something that they don't know, and additionally Donald Trump is very popular, which are the two factors that will lead him to do well in the electoral college, even if he doesn't win the popular vote again. Therefore, he will be elected in 2020, right? Those assumptions are now being justified with explanations. And so yeah, maybe I didn't go all the way to a certain proof, but I definitely pushed that argument up from assertion to some explanation, fewer assumptions. Because now, I don't need there to be as many assumptions about his election. I've demonstrated some explanation. Now, there are still some assumptions that are being made. So assumption number one, he's going to run. Assumption number two, that he is relatively popular enough that people will still support him, and so on and so forth. But that is far fewer assumptions than I needed at the very start. So that is better analysis. And I think we all agree that a speech in which someone had come up in front of you and said, Donald Trump is going to run for president in 2020 and win, would be less good than someone who did what I just did and maybe explained reasons why Donald Trump was going to win in 2020. So that's something that we will intuitively understand as good judging, good debating, and so on. But actually, what we're doing is assessing the level of assumptions, the amount of explanation that's been provided. The other side of this, though, is about likelihood. So, if you are making a more controversial or more unlikely claim, then you are on this side of the x-axis. And if you're making something that's very likely and certain, you're on the far side of the x-axis. And so these two things are complementary. Something that is intuitively very likely, or it is explained why it is very likely, and something that has a lot of explanations as to why that claim or argument is true, is in the very top right corner, and that is great analysis. Something that seems really implausible, even if it's explained very, very well, is still less good argumentation because it seems like it's not going to be possible for that to take place. Or it seems like that isn't something that's a possibility. So I'm going to come up with a great number of explanations for why Beyonce would win the presidency if she ran. But it's really implausible that Beyonce would run for the presidency, right? Not quite impossible, it is possible, I guess, but it's not likely, and it's certainly not certain. So argumentation that's based on that claim, that Donald Trump isn't going to be president in 2020 because Beyonce is going to run and he's going to lose to her, is worse argumentation than if somebody said something like Bernie Sanders is going to run against him and he's going to lose to Bernie Sanders, right? Because Bernie Sanders running is much more likely than Beyonce running. So this is what's known as warranting. Is this argumentation warranted? Is this argumentation like a reasonable tack to assume about what the world is going to be like? What is likely to occur? What is possible? What is certain? And so on. And these two things are complementary. So if you have something that is more unlikely, but it is much more thoroughly explained, those two things can substitute for each other. So I would have to do relatively little work in a debate to explain why Bernie Sanders will remain involved in American politics, because we already know that that is quite likely, and so it doesn't need me to spell out step by step why he's going to stay in politics, right? But if I was going to explain why Beyonce is going to enter American politics, I would need to go through a lot of explanation in comparison for those arguments to have the same amount of credit within the debate. So the judgment that you're making is actually a twofold one, which is not just how much explanation is provided, it's also how plausible is the argument. And this is the way that you compare arguments against one another. Because it is possible for arguments with slightly more explanation to be much more implausible and therefore less valuable to the debate than an argument that has relatively little explanation but is incredibly plausible. And writing down, or at least having some understanding of the two ways in which you're making this judgment is useful, because there's nothing worse than some team coming up to you and they're so irritated that they lost the debate because they had this great case about how amazing it would be for like Beyonce 2020, you know, Kim Kardashian would be vice president, everything would be great, and they're like, how could you not see all this explanation we put in? Well, actually, as a judge, being able to say, yeah, I recognize that there was a lot of analysis that seems to explain why this would happen, but it was very implausible, and you needed to explain why it was likely to take place, as well as, like, the argumentation of why Beyonce would beat Donald Trump, compared to their claim, which was less well explained or less thoroughly explained, but certainly much more obvious. And that comparison is just useful for providing teams with, again, more specificity about how you're making that judgment and how arguments interact with each other. Okay, so with this framework in mind, the notes that you are taking during the debate are incredibly critical, because even the amount of time that you have to come up with your justification, the 15 minutes that you and the other judges are sitting there, is not a lot of time to come up with all of this thinking from scratch. So what you need to do is you need to be doing it during the debate. You need to write down what was important, what was left unsure, what bits weren't completed, how it compared to different arguments. Was it much more likely? Was it much more certain? Did it respond to something at a higher level of that hierarchy of logic? And always make sure that you write down why it is the case, because there's nothing that teams hate more than receiving vague feedback that doesn't tie itself very specifically to the things that they are hearing. And when you consistently identify in the debate that they're doing something, so maybe they have 2 or 3 different arguments supporting their side, but each time they don't seem to be explaining that final step of evaluation. Why is this so important? Why is it better than the alternatives? Well, that's the thing I talked about right at the very start. It's a consistent failing that you can pick out. Even from one speech, you noted that 2 or 3 times, instead of providing a scale or providing an impact, they didn't complete that, and you noted that down. Well, that's then something maybe that they're doing consistently with their argumentation. Like maybe that's a consistent point of feedback that you can provide for them. Okay, so you've taken all of your notes. How should you structure your feedback? So people have broadly got 2 philosophies on feedback giving. So one of them is rank-based. So suppose this is a debate, right? We've got OG, OO, CG, and CO. The results go first, second, third, and fourth, something like this, right? Judges either will say, okay, we're going to start with closing government, who won, and explain why they beat opening opposition. Then we're going to explain why opening opposition beats opening government. Then we'll explain why opening government beats closing opposition. Or vice versa, so they'll say closing opposition lost to opening government lost to opening opposition lost to closing government. And that is the thing that they kind of emphasize, partly because the thing people care about the most is why they lost or why they won. So I think judges translate over their feelings as a speaker, in which they're like, how could I lose? And they think that that's the feedback they need to be giving. I actually think that that's very unhelpful a lot of times. And the reason it's unhelpful is twofold. So the first is, it relies on this weird law of transitivity. So for those of you who don't know what it is, the law of transitivity is like a maths term, and it basically says, if x is greater than y, and y is greater than z, then x must be greater than z, right? So if this thing is bigger than this thing, and y is also bigger than z, x must be bigger than z. But when people do rankings in this way, and they say, here's why CG beats OO, here's why OO beats OG, and here's why OG beats CO, they don't do the other comparisons as often, or they leave them until the end, or they don't pay a lot of thought to them. And so it assumes that the reason that CG beats OG is the same as the reason that CG beats OO, and that OG beats CG, and that OG beats OG. OO beats OG, right? And I don't think that that's necessarily true. Instead, I actually prefer to go through the debate chronologically. So I will start with opening government versus opening opposition, then closing government, then closing opposition. Again, this is a personal preference thing, and the one thing I'll say is always do what makes most sense to you, because if you don't understand it, you can't explain it to someone else. But chronological debate adjudication, which is a really strong personal preference of mine, is by far and away, in my opinion, the better way to give justification. So the first reason it's good is, in future debates, the teams won't know what the result is before they walk in. Obviously, the debate hasn't happened yet. So giving them feedback about debating in order of the final rankings isn't useful to the type of thinking that they have to do when they go to future debates. What they do know is, for each position, they know that there will have been speeches before them and speeches that may come after them. And so with chronological debate adjudication, you're kind of replaying the debate for them. It's like a blow-by-blow match replay. And then you say, at each point in the debate, this is what had been presented, this is what you contributed, this is what was left standing, and this is how that played out within the context of this debate. And so this basically means that teams are more likely to understand what they need to do better next time, or to focus their minds on the right strategies to try and do better next time. The second thing is, this also means that you can consider each team individually and not just compare the teams between them. So this is what I was saying earlier about how it's important to also be able to give the team that won feedback on how to improve. That doesn't happen if you're only focusing in your oral justification on why CO beats CG, why CG beats OO, and so on and so forth, right? then the only way people can get feedback on their individual strengths and weaknesses is if they come up to you for personal feedback, for which there might not be time, they might not be able to find you, they might be scared and nervous to ask. But going through it chronologically, you have to say, OG said this. Then, OO said this. This responded to these things that were already said by OG, did not respond to these other things that were already said by OG. OO could have gone a bit further and said this. Then, CG said this. And at each stage, when you're introducing the teams and you're saying, like, here's what CG said, here's what OG said, here's what OO said, that is the opportunity for you to provide individual feedback on the team's case, irrespective of the other teams, like just the case in isolation, and what was strong about it, what was missing from it, what questions you were left asking, and so on. So I think it just means that you provide them a lot more depth. Obviously, that's a lot more work than a regular debate is, so do the work during the debate itself. As the debate goes on, you should start to form your ranking through the debate. So during the OG speech, you don't know any other team, right? But you can already form judgments about what the OG is saying. So then when the OO speaks, you should constantly be able to say what is good about the OO, what is bad about the OO, is this beating OG? So by the time that the closing government starts, this comparison has already been made. You have already pretty much locked in this comparison. And I actually think it's really important to do it this way too, because if you don't do it this way, then there's a risk that something closing opposition says in response to opening government will make opening opposition seem stronger. And you will unfairly credit a team for another team's argumentation, right? It's a form of double penalty where opening government are being penalized for closing government beating them, but also being penalized by losing to opening opposition, when opening opposition, irrespective of closing government, would not have beaten them, or whatever, right? So, do the assessment. When closing government starts, assess closing government on its independent merits. Closing government will be rebutting opening opposition, so first, do the comparison with opening opposition. And then, you should have, there's a typo here, this should say OG. Then you'll have a kind of semblance of what the OG claim was and what the CG claims were, kind of their own merits. You can do that comparison. And you will have how OG responded to OO and how CG is responding to OO. And then you can compare who was better at responding. And then that means you can lock in how CG compares to OG. And then the same thing applies for closing opposition. So when closing opposition starts giving their speech, compare them to the three teams as the debate is going on. So this means that when the debate finishes, everyone says their goodbyes, you kind of already have the rankings in place because you've been paying attention throughout the debate, you've been judging as the debate is going on. And it also means that all 6 comparisons are done. So in the ranking system, you had a comparison that went first to second, second to third, third to fourth. In this system, by definition, you compare all 6 of the comparisons between the teams. And sometimes a team will have weaknesses that mean they lose to different teams for the same reasons, and that's fine. But like I said earlier, the reason you beat one team might be totally different from the reason you beat another team. And making sure that all 6 comparisons are done is the fairest way to give an adjudication, because it means that all of the teams are being considered in comparison to each other team independently and individually. And that way, you end up with, I think, an easier form of adjudication. You minimize work for yourself. Because all of that comparison you've been doing anyway during the debate, you kind of already have it in your head. You've been taking effective notes that you can now refer to very quickly. So those 15 minutes are no longer about you working out who won or lost from scratch. Instead, those 15 minutes are about reminding yourself about the debate in case you forgot something, looking over your notes to make sure that you didn't come to the wrong judgment in case something stands out and changes your mind, spending time discussing that decision with your other judges on the panel to see if they have a different perspective, maybe you missed something, and then time that you can spend working out what to give them as feedback and working out how to explain this result competitively in as much detail as possible. And so all of that ends up using your time more efficiently, I find. Judge while the debate is going on, and then your prep time can really focus on cementing those 6 comparisons. Okay, so now you've worked out how to come to your decision and all of the reasoning that you're providing. This is the shortest section, but it's basically what should my feedback contain. So when arguments compare to one another naturally, because they are in the same category, I guess, then it's really easy to make comparisons, right? So if one team says this policy is going to work, another team says this policy is not going to work because it's not going to be effective, and one team is saying it is, that's a direct comparison. They're mirror images of each other. If one team says this is going to make women happier in the workplace, another team says this is going to make women less happy in the workplace, that's a direct comparison, right? Are women happier in the workplace? There are 2 competing claims. So those are ones that are relatively easy to compare. And I think that you should always identify for the teams when arguments are easy to compare because they are in the same genre. And then what I think you should do is you should be very honest with teams about which arguments were difficult to compare for you. So there are 2 ways in which arguments can be difficult to compare. The first way arguments can be difficult to compare is that they're in different categories. So one team says this is going to make women happier in the workplace, another team says this is going to make kids sadder at school, right? So there isn't a direct comparison there. We're talking about different groups, different arenas, we're probably talking about different methods of achieving those changes. So how are you going to compare them? If that's the case, you should point out to teams that obviously these 2 things are kind of separate benefits and harms. But where possible, it might be easy for you to still make the comparison of which one should be prioritized, perhaps because one is really well explained. So team A says, this is going to make women feel happier in the workplace, and they provide a lot of explanation and analysis behind that. And then team B doesn't provide that much explanation for why kids are sadder at school. Well, the 2 things might be in separate areas, but you can still make an easy comparison in favor of the first argument. But sometimes you end up with really ambiguous goals. So what are you supposed to do if team A says that women are happier in the workplace, team B says women are sadder in the workplace, neither team explains it perfectly, or both teams explain it perfectly, and they're done to about the same level of analysis? Well, I think that you should be very honest about that. And this is a personal preference, because I think judges like to seem incredibly certain in their decisions, because they're worried that if they demonstrate uncertainty or hesitancy, it'll come across like it's not well justified. I actually think the exact opposite is true, and it's really, really important as a judge that you point out when it's difficult to adjudicate something. And the reason you should point out when it is difficult to adjudicate something is because it is not your job to adjudicate everything with certainty. It is the speaker's job to make it clear why one argument should outweigh another argument. It is their job to eliminate that ambiguity. So if you're not explaining to them when things are ambiguous, then it's unlikely that you're able to provide them with meaningful feedback on how they can prevent you being in that situation in the future. It's also far more likely that you won't have the confidence in your own decision, and that the teams won't have confidence in your own decision either. So everyone's more unhappy that way. And I really, really am super frank about these things, and I will sit down and I will say, look, I thought this argument was explained relatively well, but it wasn't quite clear what the big impact of it was. I thought this other argument, which seemed to be contradictory, was also explained to about the same level of analysis, but I still don't understand how big that impact is. If either of these teams had spent a little bit more time explaining why that argument had to beat the other argument, or why this argument was so much more important, it might have been easier for me to make this comparison, but I couldn't do it. And then you say either, because it was impossible to differentiate between the 2 teams on this basis, while I saw the credit in the arguments, it didn't determine the rankings of these 2 teams. Or you say, I determined the rankings on this basis, and the tiebreaker that you use is usually the thing I said earlier, the smallest amount of logical interference you have to make to complete an argument, right? So if I'm not sure whether it's going to affect one side or another side more, I can at least say, okay, but it seems like it would affect more people on this side. Or it seems like this is a bigger harm than the other side, even if the teams haven't done it. But I think you should be clear when you're having to do that because the teams have failed to provide that information for you. And that makes it a lot easier for you to give them honest decisions. And then finally, I just want to say, like, if you are left asking questions, and if you have time, try to offer suggestions, because it's so easy for teams to be like, well, okay, we know that we found it really hard to think of an example in history where this has worked out successfully, or like, we know we didn't have a great mechanism for how we implement this policy, but what should we have said? It's not like we didn't try. So if you can come up with suggestions, then try to offer those suggestions. And honestly, you don't have to think of yourself as a very great debater to be able to come up with a couple. It's often just about having different perspectives. Like, you know how sometimes when you're writing an essay, you just want a friend to look over it, because even though they're not smarter than you, they're in the same classes as you, they just might have a different perspective, like a fresh pair of eyes. It's like that. It's exactly like that. You as a judge are a fresh pair of eyes in this debate and a different pair of eyes to all 4 teams. So if you do come up with suggestions for things they can improve, do offer them and say, perhaps this might have been more useful. Don't penalize them for not having the same ideas as you, obviously, because again, that would be you debating against them instead of the opposite. And I think it's useful to make it clear that that isn't something that factored into the decision, it's just a suggestion. Because otherwise teams might get the wrong impression. But I find that this is a really useful way to make your adjudications as helpful as possible, especially for teams that have lost and maybe felt frustrated because they didn't know how they could have won. It's one thing to say, oh, if only I'd done this, I know I could have, but I made a bad decision. I think it's easier to deal with those losses. It's a lot harder to walk out of the debate and feel like you were going to lose the moment you walked in. And I find that this is a very important way of being compassionate as a judge. Okay, be as specific as possible about those arguments, and that is an important way, like be as specific as possible about how your arguments were valued or disvalued, and that is a good way to prevent accidentally falling victim to biases. So, cognitive biases are really, really prevalent in all aspects of society. We get trained to view certain types of speech, movement, dress as being more respectable or authoritative. Gender plays an influence, like race plays an influence, age plays an influence, reputation plays an influence. You know that someone is supposed to be the best debater in the room, or you know that someone comes from a very prestigious university, or that someone has a language status that means that they're supposed to be better at debating. Just be wary of all of those biases, and it's not even that you have to specifically try to correct against it and be like, oh my goodness, I must give women more speaker points to correct against my bias. If you are just checking that your decisions are justified, you are correcting your own biases. But you have to be aware that you might have those biases, because otherwise you will justify decisions based on your biases. So just make sure that you can always justify decisions based on those explanations, and that you can provide as much feedback for that as well. And that's a good way to make sure that you aren't accidentally rewarding a team because you think they should win, rather you're assessing those arguments. Sometimes I make quite unpopular decisions. I've made unpopular decisions at trials when I've had to select squads for Euros and Worlds. I've made unpopular decisions at out-rounds of major tournaments when I've knocked teams out. I've made unpopular decisions with teams that win and lose in debates. And teams have a sense of entitlement, people have a sense of entitlement towards those places, but to be quite frank, anybody can beat any other debater, and it is your job as a judge to make sure they have that fair shot. And if they do it, don't second guess yourself, just double check that you can justify that decision and provide that justification. Be super wary of reputational bias. Okay, speaker scores. I think that Noah would have already discussed it in the previous session, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it here. I don't know if she said this, but because some of the stuff that I've said involves a little bit more time during your justification and deliberation period, the consequence can sometimes be that not that much time is left to allocate speaks. One thing that I find is a lot easier to make it kind of faster is to, instead of saying, okay, this team won, what should their 2 speaker scores be? Just be like, which of the 8 people in this debate was the individual best speaker? And actually, you can be the best speaker in a debate and not win it. And that happens all the time. But which individual should receive the highest speaker score? Which individual should receive the lowest speaker score? So that's 2 individuals that you have to check against the scale for to correctly calibrate where they should be. But then, if they are the best and the worst speaker in the room, everybody else has to be in between them somehow. So instead of having a scale of 50 points and trying to work out where each person should be, you literally know that the scores in this room are going to be in this range, between the best speaker and the worst speaker, and now maybe you have a spread of something like 8 to 10 points that you have to allocate into 6 places. And I think that that simplifies awarding those scores, and it also just tends to be a lot faster, because then you can say, okay, so now I just have to work out whether this person was 1 point worse, 2 points worse, 3 points worse, or 4 points worse, rather than where should this person be on this huge scale? Where should this other person be on this huge scale? And so on and so forth. So that's just a kind of tip that I like to give people in terms of simplifying their speaker score awarding, especially because I make them do a lot of work for their oral justifications and their judging, and so that's the thing that suffers. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation about oral justifications and feedback. I hope that that was useful, and if it wasn't useful, then please let me know, because I want it to be useful. Like I said, I don't plan to pad this out artificially for another hour, so what I would recommend is that maybe if you guys want to take a break and finish watching the rest of that debate, but just as an exercise, and actually this is a great exercise, because at some point if you start applying for funded judge positions at tournaments and so on and so forth, you'll often have to sit a judge test where you will be asked to do this. Watch the debate that you guys started watching with Noah. It's the Red Sea Open final, and it's on YouTube. And think to yourself, how would I justify this decision? See if you could even write out a few notes of that justification, or at the very least, write out all 6 of the comparisons. Which are here, right? See if you can come up with notes for all 6 of those comparisons between the 4 teams. And then pick one of the 4 teams. Or actually, pick the team that places 4th, and pick the team that places 1st in your judgment, and then work out what feedback you would give to them. They come to you for additional feedback, and they want to know, how can I improve as a debater based on what you've seen? And then see if you can work out what you would say to the team that you ranked 1st and the team that you ranked 4th. Because I think a part of getting better at judging is making it a habit to start thinking about feedback that you're giving people, to start thinking about the 6 different rankings as the debate goes on. And habits don't stick unless you put practice in. And so let this be the start of your newfound judging self. Practice number 1, hour number 1, you go and watch that debate, and then you set yourself an exercise. With any other talent or hobby, we would do practice to improve. With speaking, we all persistently do training, we try to improve the speakers, we watch videos online, we go home and we give speeches to the mirror, we record ourselves. Well, why should judging be any different? And I think that judging is also a skill that we ought to hone, particularly because I have found that as I improved as a judge, I became a better speaker because I knew what judges were looking for and how people should judge. And then as I became a better speaker, I was able to become a better judge too, because I could provide people more feedback. So the 2 skills, I think, are very harmonious, and the best way to improve at either is to work at both. And neglecting judging at the expense of speaking is something that I think holds back a lot of debaters that could really achieve excellence. And it just makes it much harder for them to achieve progress. So make it as easy as possible, exercise all parts of your body and brain, eat well, get to sleep on time, and call your mother. Thank you, everyone.